Good afternoon and welcome to Hilltop History. Thank you for joining us for this exciting event brought to you by the 1634 Society as a part of Traditions Day and Homecoming at Home. I'm Willa Jerifo, Traditions Chair of the 1634 Society. Traditions Day is an annual event hosted by the 1634 Society that highlights the various traditions that exist at Georgetown and recognizes the importance of those traditions in creating Georgetown as we know it. Before I introduce our speakers, Paul O'Neill and Bennie Smith, I wanted to quickly share two logistical notes. Please submit questions at any time throughout the event. Our speakers will be pausing a few times to answer as many questions as they can during this hour we have together. I'm joined by Vanessa Otorola-Kehoe, Assistant Vice President in the Office of Advancement, who will be assisting Paul and Bennie with the questions. Secondly, I would like to note that this event is being recorded. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce our guests today, Paul O'Neill and Bennie Smith. Paul and Bennie are classmates from the college class of 1986 and are co-authors of a new book titled Georgetown University. The book is a collection of 200 images and captions that tell the story of Georgetown's first 200 years. Bennie and Paul worked on the project for about 2 years, combing through thousands of images and artifacts housed in the university archives, many of which had never been seen by alumni. Bennie and Paul's research led to the creation of this 250-page book that is a tribute to Georgetown and a real treat to those of us who love Georgetown but may not know the incredible story of leadership and resilience that made today's university possible. During our program, Bennie and Paul are going to talk about highlights from their book. We hope this hour will give you a best of tour of the topics, people, symbols, and enduring myths that shape our understanding of Georgetown's first 200 years. I will now turn it over to Paul and Bennie to begin their talk.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to join you all during virtual homecoming and Traditions Day. As William indicated, my name is Paul O'Neill, class of 86, and I'm here along with Bennie Smith, also class of 86, and we're co-authors, as William said, of a new book about the history of Georgetown University. The history book was a project that Bennie and I worked on for a couple of years, and it grew out of our desire for alumni and students to know more about the incredible history of Georgetown. Most of us know the basics of Georgetown history: John Carroll, Patrick Healy, Jack the Bulldog, the tombs, but there's so much more. And today we're going to explore the Georgetown story as it emerged for Bennie and me as we look through thousands of pages, photographs, and images that we explored in the Georgetown archives. The book itself, as William mentioned, is a collection of 200 images and captions that tell the story of Georgetown from its founding in 1789 to its bicentennial in 1989. You can buy the book on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, both of which are linked to our webpage, georgetownhistorybook.com. We're also on Facebook, and we'd love for you to join us there, also at Georgetown History Book. I'll note that royalties from the book will go to Georgetown's Booth Center for Special Collections in Lowinger Library. The Booth Center at Georgetown houses three things: the university archives, the rare books collection, and the art collection. Most of the images and information found in the book come from the Booth Center, and we owe a debt of gratitude to the Booth Center staff who helped us with our research. I'll note that it's not possible to cover 200 years of Georgetown's history in 45 minutes. We're only going to cover a few topics from the book. We're going to start with the story of two Georgetown founders. I say founders plural because Georgetown's history includes several presidents who dramatically altered the course or trajectory of Georgetown as a university. John Carroll, Patrick Healy, Coleman Neville's, Timothy Healy, for example, all were referred to at various times as Georgetown's founders. Today, we're only going to have the chance to talk about John Carroll and Patrick Healy. After the two founders, we're going to move away from history and talk about some of the symbols and icons of Georgetown. Again, we'll only have time to highlight a few of them, but the book covers much more. So I hope you have a chance to buy the book and see the rest of the history that it captures. So with that, let's dive right in. This is Gilbert Stewart's portrait of John Carroll, Georgetown's founder. The painting hangs in the president's office and is probably the most valuable painting in the university's art collection. John Carroll was born in 1735 in Maryland, and the context of Carroll's birth is significant because when John Carroll was born, practicing Catholicism in Maryland was prohibited. Although Maryland began as a free colony in 1632, and in 1634, the first Jesuits, Fathers White and Gravener, arrived in Maryland to create a Jesuit mission, religious tolerance in Maryland was later abandoned, and the Anglican Church was established as the state religion. Once a state religion was established, Catholics in Maryland were restricted. They were not allowed to vote. They could not serve in certain professions, bear arms, or worship publicly. Catholic education was also prohibited. To get around these restrictions, the Jesuits set up covert Catholic schools in different parts of Maryland. John Carroll attended one of these covert schools called Bohemia Manor. But when he was 13, the only way for Carroll to continue his education was to set sail for Europe and attend college at St. Omer's in French Flanders. While in Europe, Carroll entered the Society of Jesus and was ordained. He returned to America in 1773 at age 38, or at age 38 after 25 years abroad. So Carroll returned in 1773 to America. It's the eve of the American Revolution, and Carroll lived through the Revolution. But everything he did as a Catholic priest had to be covert. He had to celebrate Mass secretly and administer sacraments secretly. So suffice it to say, Carroll was deeply influenced by the enlightened principles of the American Revolution, chiefly among them, the freedom to practice one's religion. Fast forward to post-revolution in 1787, Carroll started planning for a new school that would build on the Jesuits' 250-year-old education tradition and be uniquely Catholic and American. Carroll believed that if America was to survive as a republic, it needed educated citizens to lead. The new Catholic Church in America would also need educated leaders. Carroll believed his academy could educate both for the republic and for the church. This is John Carroll's proposals for establishing an academy at Georgetown on the Potomac River in Maryland. In it, Carroll lays out plans for a new school, or academy as he called it, situated on a hilltop that he selected on the outskirts of the bustling colonial tobacco town of Georgetown. So few people know about this document, but Proposals is probably the most important document of Georgetown's history. It's Georgetown's Constitution. It's the first printed document to describe Carroll's plans for a new school. It would be impossible to read the details of the original text on screen, so I laid out here three of the important things that Proposals promised. First, Georgetown would impart knowledge and improve morals. Second, it would be open to students of every religion. And third, it would be open to students regardless of their ability to pay, or in Carroll's language, it would be open to every class of citizen. I think it's incredible, and we can all be proud, that each of these three founding principles still animate Georgetown today. I also found it interesting that the word Catholic does not appear anywhere in Proposals. So attentive was Carroll to the principle of educating students of any religious profession. An important part of Carroll's plan for the school was the establishment of an endowment. Carroll acknowledges in Proposals that the school would first have to charge tuition, but he says that tuition would eventually be eliminated when an endowment was established. Carroll created this document, Georgetown's first fundraising document, to distribute along with Proposals to all of the wealthiest Catholics in America and Europe in asking for support of the school. It began with the words, "To all liberally inclined to promote the education of youth." Unfortunately, Carroll raised only a few small gifts, but nevertheless, he moved forward with plans for the school. This lack of funding started Georgetown off on a very different footing than other American colleges that were supported by the state or the church or private endowment. In fact, the absence of a founding endowment would factor centrally in Georgetown's history throughout all of its 200 years. This is an image of Old South, the first building on campus. And this is what campus looked like for all of the years before Old North was built. Construction on Old South began in April 1788. And even though it was a very small building, it took 3 years to complete because there weren't funds sufficient to pay for materials and laborers. Old South was situated on 1 acre of land, about the location of today's quadrangle. So consider, the future Georgetown University was this one modest building on 1 acre of land. Old South would soon welcome students. William Gaston, shown here, was Georgetown's first student. He arrived in November 1791 from North Carolina, ready to start school, but Old South, the building, was not finished. But rather than return Gaston to North Carolina, the Jesuits sent him to live above a tavern in Georgetown and privately tutored him. And they did that until January 2nd, 1792, when Georgetown held its first classes on campus. Gaston was Georgetown's first student, but he did not graduate from Georgetown. Gaston left after 2 years because of a chronic cold and went on later to graduate from Princeton. Gaston was, however, a loyal alumnus. As a US congressman, Gaston was instrumental in obtaining a federal charter for Georgetown to grant academic degrees. Gaston Hall and Healy Hall, as we all know, is named in Gaston's honor. So with all of the dates we've been talking about so far, 1634 when the Jesuits arrived, 1788 when Old South was built, 1791 when the first student arrived, 1792 when the first classes began, one might wonder why Georgetown's founding year, 1789, hasn't come up. There's a story there. For 50 years after classes began in 1792, Georgetown traced its beginning to 1788, the year that the construction of Old South began. Brochures advertising the school would state, quote, "In 1788, the first house was built," close quote, implying a founding date of the school as 1788. In the 1840s, however, a visiting Jesuit writing a history of Georgetown mistakenly wrote that the construction of Old South began in 1789, not 1788. The mistake was then repeated thereafter, and further confusion was created when in 1873, a catalog printed wrote not just that the first building was built in 1789, but that Georgetown was founded as a college in 1789. It wasn't until after the centennial in 1889 that the mistake was discovered. Patrick Healey was consulted about whether to correct the mistake, but he said to leave it alone. Quote, in his words, "Making any change was bound to attract undesirable comment," close quote. But more than likely, 1789 as a founding year just made sense to Georgetown's leaders. It was highly symbolic and evocative. By using 1789, Georgetown could link its founding to the founding of the United States and also to the 1789 founding of the Catholic Church in America. As far as the factual basis for dating Georgetown's founding to 1789, it's this document, a property deed. It was January 23rd, 1789, that John Carroll took deed for the 1 acre of property on which Old South was already being built. January 23rd, 1789 is now recognized as the official founding date of Georgetown. So Vanessa, I'm gonna pause there just for a second. We're early on, but I wanted to see if there were any questions that came in that you'd like to go ahead and have us address as time permits.
Sure. So we do have one question that came in immediately. So a little unrelated to what you're speaking about, but very excited to know. Is there an additional answer to the meaning of Hoya Saxa beyond what rocks?
Absolutely, and we're going to get to it.
Okay, perfect.
All right.
Those are all the questions we have right now.
Okay. Following John Carroll, the second most consequential leader of Georgetown, known as Georgetown's second founder, is Patrick Healey. Patrick Healey is a fascinating figure. Healey was born in 1834 in Georgia. His father was a white plantation owner and his mother was enslaved. Under Georgia law, therefore, Healey and his 8 siblings were considered slaves. To avoid the consequences of slavery for his children, Healey's father sent Patrick and his siblings north to be educated, first at a Quaker school in New York, and after to the College of the Holy Cross, which was Patrick Healey's alma mater. Like John Carroll before him, Patrick Healey went to Europe to study and earn his PhD in philosophy. Healey returned from Europe and eventually came to Georgetown in 1866, and he was teaching philosophy when in 1873, at age 39, he was unexpectedly selected as president of Georgetown. But despite his young age, 39, his lack of experience and lack of any notice that he was going to become president of Georgetown, Healy very quickly articulated a transformative strategy that would elevate Georgetown College to the status of a university. He would do this by transforming the curriculum of Georgetown College to be more modern, and then by integrating Georgetown's medical school, which was founded in 1851 but was operating separately from the college, and the law school, which was founded in 1870 but was also operating independently from the college. Healy would integrate all three entities into a single institution and create what we today know as Georgetown University. As important as the administrative and curricular changes that Healy undertook, however, was the creation of Healy Hall. Healy Hall was a massive building. Its square footage was equal to all of the buildings that had been built on campus in the first 100 years of the school's existence. The clock tower soared 200 feet into the air. It was equipped with science labs, a library, a commencement hall, a museum space, and private dormitory rooms. This was a building fit for a great university. And there was something else, the orientation of the building, facing east, not facing south, like all of the buildings that came before it. Georgetown's historian, Dr. Emmett Curran, described especially well what Healy accomplished with the orientation of Healy Hall. Curran wrote, quote, "For the first time in its history, the university was constructing a building that faced not the river, but the city, as if to state visually its intention of becoming an enduring Catholic university in the capital of the United States," close quote. Building Healy Hall was a lot like building Old South. There was never enough money. The costs of the building were 4 times the amount proved by the Jesuits in Rome. The building went unfinished for 20 years. To conserve money without compromising the building's grand design, Healy instructed that parts of the building be left unfinished. A 2-story pile of construction dirt sat in place for more than a decade. The 2 east porticos were not built. Riggs Library and Gaston Hall were barn-like interior spaces for more than a decade. Gaston Hall, seen here in 2 decades, was left unfinished for more than a decade. We really owe Patrick Healy a debt of gratitude. His insistence that the beauty of the new building not be compromised for lack of finances gave us the iconic building that we have today. Healy Hall was considered so beautiful that the London News declared to be Georgetown, quote, "the Versailles of America," close quote, when it ran this 1918 photograph of the campus. Everyone who's entered Healy knows the gorgeous interiors, especially Gaston Hall. Most of the interior decorations that we see, including the entrance foyer, Carroll parlor, the grand staircase, and the philodemic room, date to 1901, when a Jesuit brother, Francis Schrone, was commissioned to decorate the interior of Healy. Gaston Hall is the most important of Brother Schrone's work. We've all experienced the beauty of Gaston, but the decorations are filled with meaning. Decoding Gaston was one of the best parts of writing the book, and we have a few slides to share what we know, chiefly from Georgetown alumnus and professor John Glavin from the class of '64. This is the stage wall of Gaston. At the very top, you'll see 6 roundels, each with 1 letter, together spelling the word wisdom. There's another set of roundels that you've probably never noticed, but if you turn around and face east, behind the very last row of balcony seats, you'll see 6 identical roundels spelling the word virtue. The presence of the words virtue and wisdom in Gaston Hall is a reminder that the Jesuits see education as a way of becoming more human or virtuous through learning. Wisdom leads to virtue. Below the roundels are 60 crests from Jesuit institutions from around the world. Georgetown's crest, highlighted here, is seen at the center. Lower in the stage wall are carvings that spell out in Latin, ad maiorem de gloriam inque hominum salutem, translated, "for the greater glory of God and the salvation of humanity." Ad maiorem de gloriam, abbreviated AMDG, is the motto of the Society of Jesus. But the most arresting decorations in Gaston are the two murals. This is mural 1 on the left side as you're looking at the stage. And in it, we have a central figure, Faith, flanked by figures of morality and patriotism. Faith holds a text open to the biblical Alpha and Omega. On her right, our left, is morality, who stands next to a tablet of the 10 Commandments. Across from morality is patriotism. She has an American flag as her cape, and the stars and stripes are decorating her shield. Symbolically, patriotism's sword is positioned in front of faith to protect faith, in the spirit of the New Republic, protecting religious freedom. The image of this mural addresses anti-Catholicism that existed at the turn of the century when these murals were being created. The mural argues that the American Republic and Catholic Georgetown were not enemies, but collaborators in a larger vision of a meaningful life in the New Republic. In the second mural, the one on the right when you're facing the stage, we see a rendering of Alma Mater, flanked by figures representing art and science. Alma Mater is draped in Georgetown's colors of blue and gray. She's extending exactly equally sized laurels to the figures of art and science, which are painted in mirror image of each other. If the first mural we saw is about patriotism protecting faith, this mural treats the topic of the church and Georgetown in relation to contemporary knowledge, specifically the inclusion of science in education. The mural conveys that Georgetown is not afraid of. Indeed, it honors the role of science in education, which throughout the 19th century was being challenged by the church. Both art and science, this mural suggests, are fit and essential partners in a Jesuit curriculum at Georgetown. Vanessa, let me take a breath there and see if there are any questions that had come in that would be helpful for us to answer before we move on to a next subject.
Sure. We have one question here that says, any idea of the inflation-adjusted cost of Healy Hall's construction?
I used to know that number. I don't know the exact dollar figure. I know that relative to today's dollars, Healy Hall was really cheap. I know the actual figures. Patrick Healy was approved to spend $100,000 to build Healy Hall. He spent $400,000 to build Healy Hall. He was in a lot of trouble with Rome. And he went on a very dangerous, from a health perspective, trip around the country to raise money to try to retire the debt. And in order to retire the debt, Georgetown was forced to sell north of 75 acres of land that it owned north of Reservoir Road. And if you think about the consequences of that land sale in order to retire the debt for the Healy building, we realized that we would have had a campus that was almost twice the size of the campus that we have today.
Great. We have another one. Were the murals at Gaston Hall painted by any renowned artist for that time?
Yeah, everything in Gaston Hall was created by the Jesuit brother, Brother Schrone. Significantly, Brother Schrone was widowed. He was married and he didn't have children. He was widowed at an early age, and he then entered the Jesuit order as a brother. He was a house painter by profession. He was not a professional painter. And everything in the interior of the Healy Hall, all of the decorative elements were all created by Brother Schrone. So every single thing that he did, including the intricate leaves that are in the ceiling throughout Healy Hall, were all done without stencil. He freehand painted every single element of the decoration of the interior of Healy Hall. The murals, likewise, were painted by him. Those were large canvases that were painted and then inserted. And the rest of the decoration, including the scheme, were done with Brother Schrone in conjunction with the architects of the building, who, like Father Healy, did not want to compromise on the beauty, the intended beauty of this building for lack of funding.
We have a few questions about the seal, but I believe you might touch on that in a bit. Is that correct?
Perfect segue, because we're going to turn to the seal now. This is another important seal of Georgetown, the University Seal. I love Georgetown Seal. I think it's one of the most beautiful seals in American higher education. These are two versions of the Georgetown Seal, the original version and a version that was created in the mid-19th century. The round version on the seal of the right was used as the official university seal for about 100 years until 1977, when Georgetown returned to the original oval seal as the official seal. I show them both because with the advent of digital media, the round seal has crept back into limited public use because it's easily colored, and the original seal is too intricate to render in color. Because it's hard to see the intricacy of the seal in the original woodcut, I've reproduced it here for illustration. The seal was created in 1798, and it has a striking resemblance to the Great Seal of the United States. The designer of Georgetown Seal, who is unknown, seems to have liked the Great Seal of the United States because the Georgetown Seal incorporates many elements of the Great Seal, including the eagle, the shield, the stars and stripes, for example. But let's look at the elements of the Georgetown Seal. Surrounding the seal are branches of oak, symbolizing strength, and olive, symbolizing peace. Further in, there is a ring around the seal containing these Latin words: Collegium Georgiopolitanum ad Ripis Potomaci in Marylandia. The reference to Maryland exists because Georgetown's founding predates the creation of the District of Columbia in 1790. So Georgetown was founded on the Potomac River in Maryland, not the Potomac River in the District of Columbia. Further inside, there are 16 stars. 16 was the number of states that were a part of the United States when the seal was created in 1798. That would be after Tennessee was admitted, but before Ohio was admitted to the Union. This mirrors the tradition of the US flag, including a star for each state when a new flag is created. In the center of the seal, in the beak of the eagle, is a scroll with the Latin phrase utraque unum. Utraque unum is taken from St. Paul's letter to the Ephesians, when Paul explains that Gentiles and Jews are one. Interestingly, utraque unum was used on coins of the Spanish Empire at the time to signify the unity of Spain with her colonies around the world. For Georgetown, however, utraque unum is thought to symbolize the unity of learning and faith. Relatedly, below, you'll see that in its talon, the eagle holds a globe and calipers representing learning and a cross representing faith. Last, at the top, above the eagle's head, is a lyre. I never paid much attention to the lyre, but the artist sure did. He or she gave it a place of prominence at the center and top, and he surrounded it with rays of light. In fact, the lyre brings together all of the elements of the seal by symbolizing the harmony and unity of Georgetown University's mission. The way a lyre works is that each string, when plucked, makes a different sound, but strung together, they produce a musical harmony, a oneness, an utraque unum. Like I said, this is a beautiful seal. We're now going to switch course, and I'm going to ask Bennie to pick up here, and we're going to talk about some of the Georgetown symbols that are related to athletics. But before I do that, Vanessa, because there was a pre-question about the seal, or is there any question about the seal that you'd like us to try to answer now?
You mentioned that it replicates the Great Seal of the United States. Just to your knowledge, is it accurate to assert that Georgetown is the only institution in higher learning that is permitted to use this image?
It's not. So it's a great myth, but it appears on some of the, well, I should say, I think it's the only non-US government. So when you think about any of the military schools, they would incorporate the eagle. I thought where you were going with the question was whether Georgetown got permission from the US government to use the eagle, and there's no record of that. I would have to explore every seal to make sure that there wasn't an eagle that appeared. If anyone on the call knows of a higher ed seal that has the eagle, we should know that. And so raise your hand and let us know. All right. Bennie, do you want me to advance to our next one?
Sure. Thank you, Paul. I think it's interesting to note that the origin of athletics at Georgetown is sort of wrapped up in the story of the origin of student government. And while we won't explore that in great detail, I think it is interesting to know that going back to November 1874 or so, at a time when administrative leadership, Patrick Healy, for example, began to sort of relax the daily life of the student, which had prior to that been very regimented. Most minutes of every day was accounted for. But Father Healy felt that there should be time in the day for the student to sort of have a period of self-reflection and personal enjoyment. And as you might imagine, students began, to use that time for athletic pursuits. So, in November of 1874, leading members of the campus student organizations, the Journal, which was a student publication, the cadets, and the band came together and organized what they thought of as a mass meeting to figure out how to organize themselves and how to think about, sort of campus life, which was, from a student's perspective, their domain. So they did two things. One is organize a committee that, looked for sponsors for the Journal, as a way to fund that. And the other was to organize a football team. So sort of two ends of the spectrum. And while those meetings happened sporadically, over the next few years, what really came out of it was the idea of student leaders sort of coming together and helping to organize what they thought of as student life, and how activities on campus would run or be administered. And that ranged from athletics all the way over to political clubs. And by the 1880s, that organization was commonly known as the Yard, which became Georgetown's sort of form of student government all the way through the 1960s, actually. So when we look at these two images, I think we readily and easily identify them as crew, what we think of as crew. The Georgetown rowing team was photographed at Poughkeepsie, New York, 14 years after the founding of the Georgetown Boat Club in 1876 by students John Agar, T.P. Kennan, and James Dolan. Considering the distant spectators were from the action, we were standing on the banks watching what was happening on the water, rowing as a sport required bright colors to distinguish boats from that vantage point on the shoreline. Intercollegiate crews began adopting colors to identify their jerseys and racing shells to their supporters. Georgetown's rowing team commissioned a group of Georgetown visitation students to make blue and gray banners for their racing shells during competition. The colors, symbolizing the reuniting of the North and the South after the Civil War, were soon widely adopted across campus in all sorts of, both athletics and non-athletic activities as Georgetown's official colors. You can go on to the next slide. Intercollegiate rivalries, around the start of the 20th century, especially in football, prompted fans to invent distinctive fight songs and cheers. Hoya, Hoya, Saxa was one that emerged by 1894 as the Georgetown cheer. Tradition holds that Hoya Saxa is a combination of the Latin Hoya and the Greek Saxa, which together are translated to mean what rocks. The origin of the cheer is uncertain, but it may certainly it may refer to an early intramural baseball team called the Stonewalls, or a large stone wall fronting the campus on what we think of today as 37th Street, or the fact that Georgetown's football team was said to have a defensive line as strong as a stone wall. We don't really know. Is sort of the short answer to the question of where we get it from, but it's certainly, I think everyone understands as being unique to Georgetown. Students may have associated Hoya Saxa with the baseball team, the campus wall, or the football team, or all three. And regardless, the cheer took root. Newspaper reporters who had commonly and previously used the term the Stonewalls to refer to Georgetown's athletics team, particularly baseball, started referring to Georgetown's sports teams in general as the Hoyas in 1928, and the tradition has carried on to today. and go on to the next slide. I think you're still on mute, Paul.
I'm back. There are three images here. This starts our lightning round of why are things called what they are at Georgetown. In the upper right is Georgetown's Jack the Bulldog. Georgetown has a long tradition of canine mascots dating back to the turn of the 20th century. But the tradition of having a bulldog serve as Georgetown's mascot dates to 1962. A student committee determined that a bulldog best represented the tenacious qualities of Georgetown athletes, and they were going to get a real bulldog to serve as a mascot. Unfortunately for the students, the university refused to fund the purchase of a bulldog, but the students went ahead anyway and raised funds through dances, and they sold stock shares. They collected enough money to pay for a 2-year-old champion bulldog, officially named Little Nan's Royal Jacket, and the nickname for the dog was Jack. The students brought Jack back to campus and tried to rename him Hoya, but the stubborn bulldog would only ever answer to Jack, never Hoya. Thereafter, Georgetown's bulldog mascots have always been called Jack, all because of a very stubborn bulldog named Jack. Below on the left there, you'll see the corner of 36th and N Streets, pictured here prior to 1962, when Richard McCooey, class of 52, opened the Tombs and 1789 restaurant. McCooey modeled the Tombs and the 1789 after Maury's Temple Bar at Yale. The Tombs name, however, comes from a line in T.S. Eliot's Book of Practical Cats, in which Bustopher Jones, known as the cat about town, was said to eat his lunch at the Tombs. It's also said that Bustopher Jones was the college nickname of Richard McCooey, which is probably why Mr. McCooey thought of the Tombs as the name of the Tombs, the restaurant. Over on the right is a picture of the Chimes. They were founded in 1946 by Frank Jones, who was a graduate of the law school. When asked about the name of the Chimes, Jones recalled in an interview that, quote, many nights we would practice under the trees on Healy or Copley Lawn, and in the beginning, we didn't have a name for our group. One night, it was 1948, as we were singing, the Healy Tower bells rang out at midnight. It was incredibly beautiful, and I said to the quartet, that's our name, the Georgetown Chimes. And since 1946, the Georgetown Chimes have been a Georgetown institution. Bill Clinton here, class of 68, is the first Georgetown alumnus to be president of the United States. This is Bill Clinton's campaign poster for his unsuccessful bid to become president of the East Campus Student Council. There used to be multiple student councils on campus in the 1960s. Anyway, the point of the slide is that if you ever walk around with a student campus tour, the tour guide will often point out when they get to Harbin Hall that it's a freshman dorm, it opened in 1964, et cetera. Oh, and that Bill Clinton lived there when he was a student. But rarely do people know what room Clinton lived in, even though the questions sometimes come up from the people who were on the tour. And the answer is that Clinton lived in Harbin room 505. And if anyone on the call lived in Harbin room 505, raise your hand and let us know, and we will send you an autographed copy of the book. That's all we have in terms of material. Thank you for this opportunity to talk about the history of a place that we all love. And Vanessa, this might be a good time before we close to see if there's any questions in addition that we might be able to answer.
Absolutely. So I did want to share that one of our attendees shared that according to an online inflation calculator, Healy Hall's cost of $400,000 in 1879 would be about $10,400,000 today. So.
Okay, so here's a good modern, so $10 million in today's dollars. Regents Hall, which is the science building on campus, cost $70 million. The Thompson Athletic Center costs $65 million. So Healy Hall was really inexpensive.
Great. We have one question that says, were there any students from Europe or any other parts of the world during Georgetown's first century?
Yes, especially at the beginning. Georgetown was really diverse in its first decade or two. specifically in the first decade, almost 20% of Georgetown students came from outside of the United States. They didn't come from far-flung places. They came mostly from European colonial islands in the Caribbean. So you saw French and Spanish being spoken on campus. In fact, Georgetown's catalogs were published in 3 languages and attracted students from the Caribbean. I know that the first Georgetown student from Brazil came in 1838. So you can imagine that journey on a boat from Rio de Janeiro up to the port of Georgetown, all to come to school and be educated at Georgetown at the beginning of the 19th century.
When did women and minorities start to play a role in Georgetown?
The first African-American, well, the Law Center was the first school to admit an African-American student. And Benny, help me with this one. I know that, I'm embarrassed because it's in the book. The first graduate of Georgetown College was Samuel Halsey, who completed school in 1952, I think. So we're talking about mid-century before the college admitted its first African-American student. And it was only within a year that either of the graduate schools, that is the medical school or the law school, admitted its first African-American student. The first female student in the college, the Georgetown College was all male until a board of directors decision in 1968 to admit women to the college. Georgetown was one of the last colleges. It trailed only Dartmouth and a school or 2 others before it crushed the all-male bastion. And the first female graduate of Georgetown College was 1972. Women, however, studied at Georgetown from the founding of the nursing school in 1903. And then women were next admitted to the graduate school in 1952. There's a really funny headline in the book from the Hoya that says that it was big news. Georgetown was to admit women to the graduate school on an experimental basis, as if it were a grand experiment. But that was the 1950s Georgetown. And that was about when we traced the first presence. The School of Foreign Service has always enrolled women, and the School of Languages and Linguistics was almost predominantly women from the time of its founding. And the business school, of course, always had women in it as well. They were all departments in the School of Foreign Service until they became separate schools.
And one slight correction, Paul. Halsey was graduated in 1953.
Okay, thank you.
Why did Georgetown Founders decide to build the university at the Hilltop? Is there any significance in terms of relevant Jesuit values?
Well, a couple of factors I would mention. First, the Carroll family was from the region. So John Carroll was familiar with the town of Georgetown, the port of Georgetown. It was the most commercially important port in colonial Maryland. It rivaled the Port of Alexandria right up until the tobacco trade started to dry up. As far as the Catholic connection, it's really hard to tell because we don't know enough about the founding of the parish of Holy Trinity to understand what connection existed, which came first. Carroll was acting independently to look for a spot where he thought a college could thrive. And primarily, and this is a part of the proposals, he wanted a place that was beautiful. So in Washington, D.C., which as we know is pretty swampy, he went outside the outskirts of the town and looked for a hilltop that was overlooking the river, which provided river breezes that would keep cool, and he thought would also help decrease the amount of contagion or disease that might be spread if we were down in the middle of a city. And the role of Catholicism in selecting Georgetown, Georgetown was no more Catholic than any other part of Maryland. There were more Catholics in Baltimore at the time than there were in Georgetown. So I think it was probably mostly driven by Carroll's desire to determine what would be the best geographic location. And he knew Georgetown. one bit, this is a little bit outside the question, but when I started with Bennie on this project, I always wanted to know, why was that 1 acre of land available for sale? Who owned it and where did it come from? Well, there was a 1,000-acre farm that was called Threlkeld Farm, and it took over all of the Georgetown campus, visitation campus, and everything north into the neighborhood that we now know as Burleigh. John Threlkeld, who was the owner of the farm, was mayor of Georgetown and went through a bankruptcy in the early 1800s. And there was an enterprising Georgetown president, Francis Neal, who started buying up little parcels of land to help get John Threlkeld out of debt to build what we think of as today's modern campus. But it was the same John Threlkeld who was selling acres of land as early as 1787 when John Carroll was looking for property to buy. And that's how we ended up situating Georgetown, not just in Georgetown, but in that particular acre in Georgetown on the hilltop.
One question here is, what led both you and Bennie to begin this endeavor?
Go ahead, Bennie.
Well, I think we both had a natural curiosity about the history of the school that we both had such a really strong, positive experience with. And we would very often ask each other questions as to, what one or the other knew about some particular thing about the school. And Paul had already worked on a work of this sort previously. So it just was sort of a natural, I think, outcome to put all this energy together to try to answer some questions and tell a story, or tell the story anyway, of what we consider to be a pretty special place.
I would add to that as a narrative, the Georgetown history is fascinating. We didn't get a chance to go into this, but this school started without any money. And throughout its history, it's really only been through the extraordinary leadership and perseverance of the leaders of Georgetown that kept it together and continue to keep it together through 2020. There's a data point that still haunts us. Georgetown is around the 15th hardest school to get into as a freshman. US News ranks us, in the low 20s. Georgetown is in the 60s in terms of financial resources. So imagine Georgetown is accomplishing with 1/5 of the financial resources what our academic peers are accomplishing. And that story isn't new. It dogged every president from the beginning of Georgetown, where they had to figure out how to keep Georgetown going. And sometimes, as it was in the case with Patrick Healy, it was through extraordinary vision that Georgetown was able to advance.
And I would also also add to that something I found through this work to be really interesting, really inspiring, really uplifting, falls under the heading of campus life or sort of student life. I was very robust and is, and I'm sure will always continue to be at Georgetown. And it's something I think we should be, all of us individually and collectively, should be more intentional about documenting, collecting, preserving, and promoting, quite frankly, whether it's in a work like this or just in conversation with one another or in the programs that we as alumni support.
There's a spread in the book that I like, especially that I think, to Bennie's point, shows the student side of this this drive that keeps Georgetown going. Georgetown has the largest student-run financial organization in the world. It has the largest student-run corporation in the country, and it has the largest student-run EMT service in the nation. Those are signals that students here are incredibly resourceful and very leaderly. And I think it's a distinctive characteristic of Georgetown that students come together and are driven to create some of these extraordinary student organizations that also, on a shoestring, accomplish what a lot of other universities are able to do with many more financial resources.
And not to beat a drum here, but it definitely, I think, bears repeating that the Corp, the credit union, and germs were all student-sponsored initiatives. These were not programs run out of out of the business school. These were not ideas from a faculty or an administrator or even an alumni. These were student led initiatives who came together and figured out how to create something that didn't exist that they believe needed to exist. And they continue to thrive today, where similar organizations at other campuses were born, lived, and no longer operate.
We have one question about, does your book discuss any part about slavery and what part it played in building of the university? And before I give you a chance to answer, I will just share a little plug for another event that is happening later today for homecoming, which is Slavery's History at Georgetown today at 4, in case anyone is interested in that as well. But for Bennie and Paul, anything related to your book and anything you want to comment on that?
Yeah, the book does address the 1838 sale of 272 enslaved people. The proceeds of some of the proceeds of which were used to pay down debt on campus. I'm very conscious that colleagues at Georgetown have gone deep and are now scholars on the subject of the sale of those enslaved people. It marked a dark part of Georgetown's history, and we do our best in the book without trying to suggest that we're somehow experts on the book, that the sale happened. It happened under the leadership of Thomas Mulady, who at that point was twice the president of Georgetown and was founding president of Holy Cross. So there's some dichotomies here. And it goes to the challenges of interpreting that dark epoch in our history. But I here would defer to the incredible work that's being done by Professor Adam Rothman and Georgetown students in the Georgetown Slavery Memory and Reconciliation Project and the Slavery Archive that's been created at Georgetown. Our book does its best to make sure that we acknowledge that it happened and provide the facts that the space limitations in the book allowed us room to present. And we hope that that strikes an appropriate representation in the book of that particular point in Georgetown's history.
I second that.
Changing gears a bit, did Georgetown's football team ever win a national championship, or was it ever nationally ranked?
Well, Georgetown's football team was nationally ranked. I don't know off the top of my head. I'd have to go back and look if we won a national championship. As you might imagine, Georgetown's football program, is very long, very storied, lots of stops and starts. It didn't consistently exist across Georgetown's history, and it was considered quite a dangerous sport. It didn't operate under the same rules and with the same equipment that we think of sort of commonly, both at collegiate and professional level. But Georgetown had enjoyed a lot of regional and national attention for football, baseball, obviously basketball, even early on, and other sports as well.
And Bennie's definitely an expert compared to me on the subject of football, but I think, Bennie, it's fair to characterize football as, or I should say, there weren't a lot of administrative fans of football. There were a couple of presidents who stepped in and said, we're going to be a great football school. But more often than not, they were saying, this is really expensive, it's really dangerous, and we're just going to cut the whole damn thing. And it was oftentimes through student perseverance that the team was resurrected. But that's a fact.
And we did come very close, and you'll see in the book, we did come very close to having an on-campus football stadium, if you can imagine, and not sort of a ramshackle, multi-purpose sort of thing, but a real, actual football stadium. But that got nixed as being very expensive and not consistent with the school's overall priorities at that time.
Great. One question here, how did we go from 1 acre to 150 acres?
So that goes back to that, to the farmer, John Threlkeld. everything around Georgetown eventually came up for sale. And this President Neal, he was incredible. He was the guy who would go, and every time John Threlkeld needed an ATM from his bank or from his farm, he would sell a few acres to Georgetown. There's an image in the book. I'd never seen this map before. It's a hand-drawn map that in all of the little quadrants show how the campus grew and by how many acres. So at one point, John Threlkeld sold 68 acres, and that created a new segment of the campus. And then the other thing that I referred to earlier was there's a whole precious 76 acres above Reservoir Road that Georgetown once owned. That was John Threlkeld's farm too, that we sold when we were paying down the debt of the Healey building. But in the book, there's a really fun map to look at and just to see how that and the Visitation Convent also emerged over the course of the years. Georgetown, there's another book to be written about Georgetown's real estate and some of the decisions that were made over the course of its history for financial reasons, to sell or not to buy. And it's regrettable, but it's our lot that we have these 104 acres, and we're now looking at other places in the city, including Georgetown downtown as a campus, to try to get around that constraint.
Paul, this question goes to the comment you made earlier about Georgetown's endowment size comparatively. Why is Georgetown's endowment size relatively small compared to its peer schools? And how do you feel the future would look like?
That's a very long answer. If I were to write another book, it would be about the history of Georgetown's financial resources. Why in 1789 were the wealthiest Catholics not willing to support John Carroll's endeavor? Why was it in 1881 that Georgetown alumni did not step up to help pay or retire the debt of the Healey building? Why in the 1950s, when Georgetown and Notre Dame were beginning their fundraising efforts, that Notre Dame basically took off in the 50s. So we were about equal then, and Georgetown is where it is. There's an answer, but I don't know the answer. And I won't speculate because it really requires understanding a lot of relatives. So for example, was it because Georgetown's Catholic? Was it because Georgetown's in a city? Was it because I don't know why? But I think it's worthy of study to know why we are where we are and how we get from where we are to where we need to be if the school is going to continue to thrive.
Great, and we will end with this. I know we didn't get to all the questions, but one person wanted to share. Bennie and Paul, thank you so much for your dedication to bring this history alive. Are you giving any seminars to current students?
We'd love to.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Anne. We'd love to do that for sure.
And I really, maybe Vanessa in this, and then I know we got to stop, but the stop date of this book, 1989, is well before the date of birth of many people on this call. 3 decades have passed since Georgetown's bicentennial. So I trust that someone younger than Bennie and me will take up the mantle of writing the history after this one as soon as the world is ready for it. Georgetown post 1989.
Great. Well, I think that is all the time we have right now. William, I think you were going to come back on.
Yep, I just wanted to say thank you to Paul and Bennie for being a part of this today. I feel like I know I learned a lot. I bet everyone else listening did. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you for writing that book too. I started reading it the other day. It's very cool. And thank you as well to everyone who tuned in and being part of the Traditions Day event, 1634 Society. Thanks you all. Thank you. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.